It was uncomfortable. Clint had spent decades perfecting emotional distance, and vulnerability didn't come naturally. But he kept trying, motivated partly by the knowledge that Ranger wouldn't be there much longer, and he needed to build other connections before that loss left him completely adrift. His daughter Morgan noticed the change. "You're different, Dad," she said during a visit. "More present." "Ranger's teaching me," Clint admitted. "He's dying. And I'm realizing that he's been the best relationship I've had in years. That's pathetic, and it needs to change." Morgan, surprised by her father's rare candor, squeezed his hand. "It's not too late. We're here. We want to be closer to you. We always have." By 2018, Ranger could barely walk. The hip dysplasia had progressed despite all treatments. He was 12 years old for a large lab, and clearly in pain more often than not. Clint knew what was coming, had been preparing himself for months, but the reality of losing his closest companion was devastating to contemplate. The decision to euthanize came in early spring. Ranger had stopped eating, could no longer stand without help, spent most of his time sleeping. The vet gently suggested that they were approaching the end, that the kindest thing would be to let Ranger go while he still had some dignity. Clint scheduled it for a Saturday morning, a clear, beautiful day when the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and eucalyptus. Across his property, the mobile vet came to the house so Ranger could die at home, in familiar surroundings. Clint held Ranger on the back porch, the same porch where they'd spent countless evenings together, overlooking the land they'd explored together for 14 years. He talked to Ranger as the vet prepared the injection, talked about all the films they'd made together, all the walks on the beach, all the quiet moments that had meant more than any award or accolade. "You saved my life," Clint whispered, his voice breaking in a way it rarely did. "During the richest, loneliest years, when I had everything and nothing, you were there. You didn't care about the money or the fame. You just cared about me. That's the purest love I've ever known. Thank you, Ranger. Thank you for staying." The injection was administered, and Clint felt the exact moment when Ranger's breathing stopped, when his body went from living weight to lifeless mass. He held the dog for a long time after, not ready to let go, not ready to face the emptiness that would follow. They buried Ranger on a hill overlooking the ocean, a spot where the dog had loved to sit and watch the waves. Clint designed a simple stone marker, Ranger Eastwood, 2004-2018, faithful friend. "Better than I deserved." The grief that followed was profound and overwhelming. Clint had lost people he loved over the years, parents, friends, colleagues, but losing Ranger felt different. The dog had been his anchor during years when everything else felt unstable. His one uncomplicated relationship in a life full of complexity. The house felt impossibly empty without Ranger's presence. No clicking of nails on hardwood floors, no jingle of tags, no warm body pressed against his leg while he sat on the porch. The routines that had structured his days for 14 years now emphasized absence, morning walks taken alone, afternoon quiet without a dog to break it, evening solitude that felt suffocating. For weeks, Clint struggled. He threw himself into work. He was preparing the mule, but even work couldn't fill the void Ranger had left. His children noticed and increased their visits, worried about their father's mental state. Friends checked in more frequently, concerned about the old man living alone in his vast ranch. "I don't know who I am without him," Clint admitted to his son Scott during a particularly difficult conversation. "Sounds crazy, he was a dog, but for 14 years he was my constant. My only real relationship, and now he's gone, and I'm 88 years old, and I don't know how to do this alone." Scott, moved by his father's vulnerability, stayed at the ranch for a week, just being present. Other family members followed suit, creating a rotation so Clint wouldn't be alone during the worst of his grief. Slowly, painfully, Clint began to understand what Ranger had been trying to teach him all along. That connection matters more than achievement. That presence is more valuable than perfection. That love, even from a dog, especially from a dog, can sustain us through the darkest times. As Clint entered his 90s, a milestone few expected him to reach given his lifestyle. An age, he reflected, often on the years with Ranger, on what the dog had meant during the richest and loneliest period of his life. "I had everything and nothing," Clint said, in a rare moment of complete honesty during an interview. "More money than I could spend, more awards than I could display, more property than I could use, and I was profoundly lonely. Ranger was there through all of it. He didn't solve the loneliness. A dog can't fix human isolation, but he made it bearable. He gave me something to care about beyond myself. That was the gift." The lessons Ranger taught stayed with Clint as he aged. That wealth without connection is hollow. That success without relationship is meaningless. That the simplest bonds between a man and his dog can be the most sustaining. Clint made efforts in his final years to repair relationships with his children, to be more present with his grandchildren, to build the connections he'd neglected during his working years. It was awkward sometimes, these attempts at closeness from a man who'd spent his life maintaining distance. But his family appreciated the effort, recognized the growth. Ranger changed him, Morgan told her siblings. Dad was always so closed off, so isolated by choice. But that dog, losing that dog, it cracked something open, made him realize what he'd been missing. Better late than never. In 2023, at 93 years old, Clint Eastwood looked back on 9 decades of life, the poverty of his youth, the struggles of his early career, the success of his middle years, the wealth and loneliness of his later decades, and he recognized the years, with Ranger as among the most important. "That dog saw me at my worst," Clint reflected. "Saw me wealthy and miserable, successful and isolated, surrounded by luxury and drowning in loneliness. And he stayed anyway. Didn't judge, didn't leave, didn't ask me to be anything except present. That's grace. That's what saved me during those years." The ranch in Carmel by the Sea still stood, quieter now, occupied by an old man and an old dog moving slowly through their days. The wealth remained. Clint was still one of the richest figures in Hollywood, but it had been put in perspective by years of learning what actually mattered. Charlie, now 12 years old himself, was in declining health. Clint knew he'd face another loss soon. Another goodbye to a companion who had helped him through difficult years. But he was better equipped now, less isolated, more connected to family and friends who would support him through the grief. "Ranger taught me how to do this," Clint told Charlie, scratching behind the dog's ears with practiced gentleness. "How to love something even though losing it will hurt. How to be present even when it's hard. How to stay even when leaving seems easier. You're teaching me the same lessons, buddy. I'm listening better this time." The dog who stayed through Clint Eastwood's richest and loneliest years had been more than a pet, more than a companion. Ranger had been a teacher, a therapist, a lifeline during years when Clint had everything the world said should make him happy but felt emptier than he'd ever been. Through simple presence, through uncomplicated devotion, through the daily routines of care and companionship, Ranger had shown Clint what actually mattered. Not the size of your bank account or the number of your awards, but the quality of your connections, the depth of your relationships, the willingness to be vulnerable enough to need another being and let them need you back. As Clint watched the sun set over his California ranch, the same view he'd watched with Ranger, thousands of times, he felt something he hadn't felt during those lonely years: gratitude. Not for the wealth or the fame or the success, but for the 14 years with a yellow lab who had stayed when Clint had nothing to offer except himself. "Thank you, Ranger," Clint whispered to the memory, to the ghost of a dog who had saved a lonely old man by refusing to let him be completely alone, for staying, for teaching me, for loving me when I was at my worst. You were the best thing about those years, the richest, loneliest years of my life, and you were the one thing that made them bearable. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Charlie stirred beside Clint's chair, pressing closer as evening chill set in. And Clint, wealthy beyond measure, but finally understanding what true richness meant, scratched behind his current companion's ears and felt, perhaps for the first time in decades, truly at peace. The dog who stayed through Clint Eastwood's richest and loneliest years had left behind a legacy more valuable than any film or award. The lesson that love doesn't require wealth or success or perfection, only presence, patience, and the courage to stay even when everything else falls away. Especially when everything else falls away. That was Ranger's gift. That was what saved Clint Eastwood when he had everything and nothing. And that was what he'd carry forward for whatever years. Remained the understanding that sometimes the most important relationships come with 4 legs and a wagging tail. That sometimes salvation comes from something as simple as a dog who refuses to let you be alone. That sometimes the richest man in the room is also the loneliest. Until someone stays. Ranger stayed. And in staying, he taught a legend how to be human again.